going to get into graphing now. So the way we're going to do this is, the way I always say is best to graph something you don't know is to make a table. So we're going to graph sine and cosine. So what you're going to do is use your unit circle to find the sine of each of these angles, and then find the cosine of each of those angles at the same time. So pause the video, fill this table on your paper, and there's more to it, so leave some space underneath to fill in the second half of this. This is only the first half. The second half is right here, so pause the video again and fill in the sine over here and the cosine over there. All right, check your answers with mine and make sure they're matching. We're going to use these points in just a sec. All right, here's the answers for the second part. Check your work, make sure it matches. So now we're going to graph the functions y equals sine of x and y equals cosine of x. So you're going to label each angle measure column with an x, that's our input, and then you're going to measure the output with y. So what that's going to look like is our theta, this is our x, and this is our y. And you can do it for both right now, because we're going to do both eventually, but right now we're focused on just sine. So what that's going to look like is we're going to plot it on a graph. So what I want you to do is copy this graph down. So what's important here is this is 0 for a y, and then it counts by pi over 2 pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then our y, our biggest value here was 1, and our smallest value was -1. So copy that table, copy that graph down on your paper. It can be a rough sketch too. You don't need to draw every grid. Just draw this part here, and maybe like a dashed line at 1 and -1. So how we're going to graph this is we're just going to plot points. So our y values, we had 0, we had 1/2, and then we had the square root of 2 over 2. Now this, as a decimal, is what we needed. So I want you to take your calculator and do the square root of 2 over 2. What answer does that give us? Also do the square root of 3 over 2, and then our biggest one was 1. So we got to know what these are as decimals, so take a second to do that. So here's what I got for decimals. Now we're going to graph it. So our first point was 0. When the angle was 0, our sine was 0. So we can make a dot there. Now these are counting by, if we want to fill this in, it's counting by pi over 6s. So that's why we split it up the way we did. And we can add pi over 3 here. So that's pi over 6. 2 pi over 6 reduces to pi over 3. 3 pi over 6 reduces to pi over 2. So at pi over 6 we had 1/2. At pi over 3 we had 0.71. I'm sorry. At pi over 3 we had 0.87. And then in between it right here, that halfway point, we had that 0.71. And then at pi over 2 we had a 1. So our graph starts to look like this. So continue graphing and fill that whole thing out and see what shape comes up. So you should have gotten a shape like this. This is the graph of a sine function. So one important thing to just make note of is that it's just going to keep going in this wavy pattern. It's just going to wave forever because we just keep going around the same circle. Now we're going to move on to cosine. So we're going to graph our cosine graph. So it's going to be the same, except now we're going to graph with cosine. So sketch another graph with these coordinates on it, and then take the time to graph cosine. So cosine, the cosine of 0 was 1. And with cosine, we were moving down in this fashion. So graph that whole cosine graph, and then when you're ready, unpause the video. So your cosine graph should look something like this. Now, one question I want to ask is how long does it take to complete one period or one cycle for these graphs? How long does it take to get back exactly where it started? So look at your sine graph. How long did it take to get back to where you were starting again? How long did it take the cosine graph to get back where you started? So it takes 2 pi. So it would go down, we go up, and back up at 2 pi. If you think about your sine graph, our sine graph started here, we went up, down, and back to the middle. So it kind of is to the back there, but it's going down at that point. So really to restart the cycle, it also took 2 pi. So your closure for the day is to answer this question. How does the graph of cosine compare to the graph of sine? List similarities and differences. And that's all for today's lesson.